Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. Welcome to this afternoon's plenary. It's a huge pleasure to be able to chair this panel today. We are celebrating 50 years of critical race studies. What I'm going to do is I'll read out our panelist biographies, and then they will come up and give their talks. Our first speaker is Ruben Espinosa, who is Associate Professor of English at Arizona State University and Associate Director of the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. He's the author of Shakespeare on the Shades of Racism, which came out in 2021, Masculinity and Marian Efficacy in Shakespeare's England, 2011, and co-editor of Shakespeare and Immigration in 2014. He was a trustee of the Shakespeare Association of America between 2018 and 2021, and he serves on the editorial boards of Shakespeare Quarterly, Exemplaria, Medieval Early Modern Theory, and Paul Graves' Early Modern Cultural Studies series. He's currently at work on his next monograph, Shakespeare on the Border, Language, Legitimacy, and La Frontera. Joining him is Lisa Barksdale-Shaw, who is an assistant professor in the Department of English and member of the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. I'm getting a kind of Tempe, Arizona vibe over here. Her work explores narratives of justice by combining several disciplines, including law, literature, and medicine. Her dissertation examined how dramas present stage properties like letters, contracts, and wills in early modern theater. She's the author of articles and book chapters on Shakespeare and law, is currently working on several research projects, specifically on written evidence, conspiracy, and racial trauma. Also on the program is Ian Smith, who is the Richard H. Jr. 60 and Joan K. Sell Professor in the Humanities in the Department of English at Lafayette College. He's the author of Race and Rhetoric in the Renaissance Barbarian Errors, published in 2009, and collaborator on Othello Reimagined in Sepia, 2012. His current monograph, Black Shakespeare, Reading and Misreading Race, will be published in 2022. He's the recipient of multiple fellowships in support of his scholarship, being invited most recently to hold the Los Angeles Times Chair in the History and Culture of the Americas at the Huntington Library between 2022 and 2023. He serves on the editorial boards of Shakespeare Quarterly and ELR and has published numerous articles and book chapters, mainly on Shakespeare and early modern drama. He is also the vice president of the Shakespeare Association of America. So please welcome Ruben.
Thank you so much, Farah, for that introduction. And I want to thank Ian Smith also for putting this panel together and inviting me to be a part of it, and to congratulate him publicly for being elected as the future president of the SAA. So that's great. Okay. Borders, Bridges, Shakespeare, and My Twin Skin. We celebrate the emergence, the existence, and the place of early modern critical race studies on this, the 50th anniversary of the SAA. I would not be standing here today if it were not for the sustained efforts of the many scholars of color who, despite unrelenting gatekeeping within our academy, opened the door and made sure it was kept open for so many of us who followed. The emergence, the existence, and the place of early modern critical race studies points to the future of our field and the future of SAA. We have, I believe, much to celebrate. It is fitting then that I take my cue this afternoon from one of the luminaries in our field who helped define the direction of early modern critical race studies, Kim F. Hall. In her stunning talk at the SAA Plenary in 2019, Hall offered her personal meditation on archives meant to celebrate white achievement. It was her personal voice, what she called her strange style, if you will, that animated those experiences so poignantly. In today's talk, I seek to sing my own new scholarly song, to quote Hall and Peter Erickson. As I reflect on the influential force of early modern critical race studies, I want to explore what it has meant for me, a brown-skinned Chicano, to enter an academy that is overwhelmingly white and to study an author who is, in so many ways, a monument to white achievement. What has it meant for me to navigate, and I borrow from James Baldwin here, the weight of whiteness? And I ask not the tired formulation, what can Shakespeare teach us about La Frontera, but rather, what can the Chicanx experience in La Frontera teach us about Shakespeare? The US-Mexico border offers a distinct set of tensions and modes of self-understanding, and it is the ethos of this borderland conflict and energies of resistance therein that today's talk considers in an effort to make evident how apprehensions about legitimacy and how notions of belonging for Chicanxes hold power to cast a novel, forward-looking light on Shakespeare and early modern critical race studies. So the talk is in 4 parts. Part 1, borders. The act of crossing a border is thick with trepidation. As Gloria Ansaldúa argues, borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. Or, as Rosaura Sanchez says, the US-Mexico border is a social and political space used to demarcate political boundary and hegemonic power. The weight of that is palpable. Whenever we would visit Juarez when I was younger, we would have to wait in the long line of the International Bridge to return to El Paso. Vendors would walk between the cars selling sodas, snacks, paletas, and souvenirs. You could hear the music and laughter in our car and coming from the cars of others. I distinctly remember the feeling of inching closer to the US Customs and Immigration checkpoint. It was a visceral shift. If we were laughing, my mom's voice from the front seat would say, "Ya cállense, vamos a cruzar," or "Be quiet, we're going across." The radio would be turned down, my siblings and I would sit upright, tense up a little in our silence, and when the customs officer would ask us nationality, we would answer, American. Always, my mom and dad would have to show identification because their English, unlike ours, was broken. To cross that bridge back home felt fraught with insecurity, and yet there we were, in these sister cities that belonged and did not belong to us, exchanging one language for another and yet never feeling at home in either. In the decolonial imaginary, Emma Perez describes how borders, political, geographic, discursive, shape historical knowledge. We cannot escape the boundaries that our Chicana minds have inherited, Perez writes, as we take imaginary journeys beyond the Rio Bravo into Mexico, Latin America, or across the Atlantic Ocean to Asia, Africa, and Europe, traversing borders and centuries to link time and space. In these imaginings, time is linear and geographic areas are mapped. Perez goes on to say, with these categoric spaces, we continue to conceptualize history without challenging how such discursive sites have been assigned and by whom. This, she argues, enforces a type of colonialist historiography. One of those categoric spaces is the Renaissance, a period whose contours are painfully familiar to us. We know well how they have been assigned and by whom. As Margot Hendricks puts it, periodization is the often unquestioned form of academic gatekeeping. It has borders, and when one tries to cross those borders, it can feel a little tense. My own work has sought to put Shakespeare into conversation with contemporary views of Latinx, and more specifically Chicanx experiences and culture, and this has not always felt seamless. In many ways, it mirrors a feeling, my feeling, of crossing a border into and out of Shakespeare's studies. It both belongs and does not belong to me. I both belong and do not belong in it. Like many of you, when people learn what I do, I often get the question, why Shakespeare? Most of the time, it is sincere curiosity, but there are times when it is clear that the question they are asking is, why are you doing Shakespeare? And I cannot tell you how many times over the years I have been asked, you didn't want to do Chicano literature? Depending on who is asking, I'm either an outsider or I'm a vendido, a sellout, or I am both. And there's a rub. You see, when I would cross the US-Mexico border and answer American, that truth hung in the air. But in my brown skin, I have never been allowed to feel American, not even in a city with an 80% Mexican-American population. Borders have a strange way of reminding you that you are always just a bit too close to unbelonging. I often think about the way my command of the English language, my ability to enunciate clearly American or US citizen, meant I didn't have to prove I was a citizen. But what about the other side of that coin? What was I leaving behind as I took up my English? Don't get me wrong, and don't project onto me what you think is the Chicanx experience. I'm not being nostalgic here. I am simply acknowledging that my acceptance depended on approximating in the only way I could the whiteness that defined my nation. It was only my English-speaking linguistic identity that legitimized me in their eyes and ears, and even then, that legitimacy was tenuous. As Ansaldúa says, the only legitimate inhabitants are those in power, the whites and those who align themselves with whites. And when I came to Shakespeare, I did not do it with the aim of interrogating his iconic status and all that he represents in the way of white supremacy. I will readily admit that I came to it with a desire to say American and to be let in. Once within, though, well, those borders felt real. In my brown skin, I was always just a bit too close to unbelonging. Part 2, bridges. The act of ascending a bridge is thick with expectation. We think of bridges as offering a connection of allowing for coalition, togetherness, belonging. They don't, not always. Sometimes we have to imagine the bridges that do just that. In reality, as Arturo Aldama writes of the US-Mexico border, once crossed, the border is infinitely elastic and can serve as a barrier and zone of violence for Mexicanaos, Centroamericanaos, and other Latinaos confronted by racialist and gendered obstacles, material and discursive, anywhere they go in the United States. This results in a continual shifting from margin to margin. It is a feeling of alienation that persists. Still, the figurative bridges amid the very real borders have allowed me to make a connection that I deeply value. These bridges have led me to my intellectual home. While I was working on Shakespeare and immigration, I was able to look at Shakespeare with fresh eyes, and that is because of the amazing contributors to that collection. In particular, Peter Erickson encouraged me to look beyond Shakespeare, to find a bridge in a separate direction. Around that time, Ayanna Thompson asked me what my next project would be. I told her I was thinking of working on hagiography, to consider the vulnerability of certain bodies in our present moment through the vulnerability of bodies in the past. In the way that only Ayanna could present it, she responded with the obvious, why not just consider vulnerable bodies in the present? I was on a bridge. In his chapter on critical race studies in the Art and Research Handbook of Contemporary Shakespeare Criticism, Arthur Little writes, the ways we police our bodies and scholarship and the ways our bodies and scholarship are policed sit at the evidentiary core of Shakespeare and early modern critical race studies. Critical race studies builds from here, working through the archive and critical race theorizing to take on issues of race, embodiment, the human, whiteness, blackness, anti-blackness, brownness, swarthiness, intersectionalities with gender, sex, able-bodiedness, religion, class, sexuality, queerness, nationality, to better understand it as phenomenon and epistemology, not only in the workings of Shakespeare's 16th and 17th centuries, but also in Shakespeare's afterlives, including in Shakespeare studies past and present. It is, to borrow from Ayanna Thompson, capacious. The key is to engage deliberately with the rich legacy of early modern critical race studies as a means of recognizing in the ongoing resistance to racist structures a bridge between black and brown that has the potential to leave a lasting legacy for Shakespeare studies in our time and beyond. And I reiterate, that legacy is rich. From the early work of Aldred Jones in the 1960s to Anthony Bartholomew in the 80s, the critical attention to race, as Little tells us, demonstrates that Shakespeare could be posed critically to operate as a counter-narrative to the terrorization of black lives. The social and political energies are clearly in place, and although today's talk is not a retrospective, I do want to point out that we are indebted to them and to the many scholars who followed thereafter who insisted that critical race studies was not just a viable area of study, but a necessary one. As I began to lean into work that addressed the oppressive structures aimed at me and my people, I had a platform from which to begin, one that demonstrated the possibilities of using Shakespeare as a vehicle to address the social and racial inequities that surround me. Indeed, long before I or anyone else in our field was thinking about Shakespeare and Latinx perspectives, Margot Hendricks employed Gloria Ansaldúa's Borderlands, La Frontera, to consider how, and I quote, a borderland also coalesces on an ideological level in the concept of race within A Midsummer Night's Dream. In this essay that's nothing short of brilliant, Hendricks bridges Ansaldúa's understandings of borderlands to the figurative evocation of India, which marks the play's complicity in the racialist ideologies being created by early modern England's participation in imperialism. In employing Ansaldúa, Hendricks is vividly attuned to the long reach not only of British imperialism, but also of US imperialism to our present moment. By interrogating how India is imagined in Shakespeare via a theoretical framework focused on Chicanexes and mestizaje, and with critical race studies informing her approach, Hendricks creates bridges to witness how people of color are being used to bolster and sustain perceptions of white superiority then and now. From my perspective, all of it needs to begin by addressing and challenging anti-blackness. There can be no hope for what John Marquez calls a model of praxis of solidarity for Blacks and Latinxes with shared experiences of expendability if we do not begin with acknowledging the prevalence of anti-Blackness across an array of racial and ethnic groups, including Latinx communities. I want to be clear that Marquez is not conflating the histories of Black and Latinx Americans, but rather he is pointing to the fact that the same systems of white supremacy seek to oppress both groups. As such, there is a clear need for solidarity. Closer to us, the promise behind such solidarity opens a critical space to dislocate Shakespeare's presumed place in America and to imagine his cultural relevance anew. In discussing her experience of being arrested in San Jose, California on charges of conspiracy, Angela Davis says that her case would not have been won had it not been for the activism of the Chicano community there. In San Jose, Davis explains that there was a minuscule Black community, and it was in the Chicano community that the major organizing took place. I don't understand how people can assume that it's possible for each racialized ethnic group to go it alone. And yet, for so long, we saw in activism and in our academy the persistence of such silos. The emergence, the existence, and especially the place of early modern critical race studies today has shown the importance of bridges within our field. Part 3, Shakespeare. The act of decentering Shakespeare is thick with possibility. As Ayanna Thompson notes, Shakespeare was never, and therefore is never, coherent, stable, fixed, and defined. Instead, he is always defined through the recreation of his identity, image, texts, and performances. He needs to be rendered as contingent, as in process, and as passing, as a creative moment in which his name, image, text, and performance are invoked. I want then to consider the invocation of Shakespeare when related to the oppression of Mexicans and Chicanexes. In his chapter aptly titled Manifest Destiny, James Shapiro considers the rather infamous anecdote about Ulysses S. Grant cross-dressing to play the role of Desdemona in a staging of Othello in Corpus Christi, Texas in 1845. This was on the eve of the Mexican-American War. I'll sidestep the details of Grant's rehearsing for but never playing the role of Desdemona to focus instead on the way Shapiro uses allusions to Shakespeare to discuss the implications behind this historical moment. While Shapiro acknowledges the injustice behind the U.S. invasion of Mexico with the aim of extending slavery and U.S. imperialism, his focus seems to be on anticipating the larger issue. Always the Civil War looms in the background. What happens to Mexico and to the many Mexicans and indigenous peoples living within the geographic spaces that now define the American West is left underexplored. I don't want to mischaracterize what Shapiro is doing here. He does note that, and I quote, "The Mexican-American War redefined the physical boundaries no less than the moral ones of a republic turned empire." In other words, he gets the brutality behind the U.S. invading Mexico, and then, quite frankly, reneging on the contracts they made. But in pointing to the war's end, Shapiro highlights the death toll on American troops and then the death toll on Confederate soldiers nearly 20 years later. Mexico and Mexicans are a mere backdrop to a divided America of that era and to the performances of Shakespeare that he uses to frame that historical moment. Perhaps one might be tempted to point out to me that the book is about a divided America, and thus Americans are central to that. Sure. But my history as an American is deeply entangled in that war. It is not merely whiteness that defines that America. For the many Mexicans living in those territories, the after effects of that invasion and the land grab with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo were disturbing and enduring. For example, Arturo Rosales writes, in 1847, as U.S. troops were registering victory after victory in the Mexican War, the Illinois Star Register opposed annexation because the U.S. would have to absorb a mixed race, little removed from the Negro. Senator John C. Calhoun from North Carolina felt that racially impure Mexicans were not even as good as the Cherokees or Choctaws. A continuation of such rejection served to keep Mexicans marginalized and from assimilating even when they wanted to. Members of the elite, many of who were white or appeared to be without Indian or African physical features, hawked a racial identity which separated themselves from the markedly mestizo Mexican lower classes, end quote. It is what Carrie McWilliams calls the fantasy heritage. It is what I call a desire to approximate whiteness so as to benefit from the privileges that this nation affords to whites. We, Chicanxes, also live in an America with manifold divisions. We too are American, but not everyone believes that. So often, there is a deliberate effort to undermine the confidence of Chicanxes, as in the case with the dismantling of the Mexican-American Studies program in Tucson High School. I have written about this incident at length, and so will only briefly describe it here before offering some thoughts on it. And I'm sure you'll recognize this as a moment of shameless self-promotion here, but I did want to put up, more specifically, the two collections which are rich in the essays that they contain, so if anything, turn to them for the other essays and not mine. So I have, at a student assembly at Tucson High School in 2007, Dolores Huerta encouraged students to use their voices and their right to vote to challenge a state that had passed the infamous SB 1070 into law in Arizona. Huerta told these students, Republicans hate Latinos. The Tucson Independent School District superintendent at the time, Tom Horn, was incensed because he is Republican. He sent his aide to organize the second student assembly and explain to the students that Republicans did not, in fact, hate Latinos. But when she began to address the audience, the students turned their back on her and raised their fists in the air. Horn made it his mission to dismantle the Mexican-American Studies program at Tucson High, and he was successful. Arizona State House Bill 2281 was passed into law in 2010 and disallowed educators from teaching anything that addressed or provoked conversations about race, colonization, oppression, class, and or power. Might sound familiar these days. As a result, educators had to identify texts that could lead them to violate the law, which had stiff financial penalties and even in some cases would lose teachers their jobs. And this is better known as Tucson's banned books list. Amid the list of books was Shakespeare's The Tempest. Most of us can guess why this book was being taught in a Mexican-American Studies program, so it's not my aim to reflect on the why or the how. Instead, I want to point out that much of the outcry regarding this episode had to do with the fact that Shakespeare was being banned. What is left under-examined is the fact that the people in position of power were actively working to silence the voices and undermine the confidence of young Chicanxes. That was not the story. But they should get their Shakespeare, eat their spinach, as Ayanna Thompson says, but it shouldn't come from a place that allows them to explore their own histories. It shouldn't fall on the Tucson High School teacher, Curtis Acosta, to use Shakespeare in this way. It shouldn't fall on Tony Diaz to found Libro Traficante as a way to promote the many books on that list. And it shouldn't fall on me to recognize in Shapiro's work the erasure of us Americans. Too often, however, it does fall on us. We can and we should all decenter Shakespeare. We can and we should all decenter whiteness. Part 4, My Twin Skin. The act of crossing a border leaves me longing. It is hard to explain what the sense of place on either side of the border registers for me. It is experiencing a cultural richness that is both overwhelming and familiar. What I long for is to translate the energies found in La Frontera into meaningful change, into efficacious resistance. Too often, though, I feel lost. In his 1967 epic poem, Yo Soy Joaquin, which became a rallying cry of the Chicano movement, Rodolfo Corky Rodriguez describes the experience of being Chicano. I look at myself and see part of me who rejects my father and my mother and dissolves into the melting pot to disappear in shame. I sometimes sell my brother out and reclaim him for my own when society gives me token leadership in society's own name. I am Joaquin, who bleeds in many ways. And to disappear in shame is the precarity of getting lost in the dominant society, of getting lost in Shakespeare, of gazing on that symbol of white achievement and celebrating it. In her stunning play, Where We Belong, Madeleine Sayet explores the uses of Shakespeare as a tool of assimilation and a tool of the erasure of indigenous languages. With absolute candor, Sayet says at one point, "You don't have to make people love Shakespeare. He's not intrinsically superior." But he has been positioned that way by so many. The stakes behind this are so important. As Richard Dyer argues, for those in power in the West, as long as whiteness is felt to be the human condition, then it alone both defines normality and fully inhabits it. White people have power and believe that they think, feel, and act like and for all people. White people, unable to see their particularity, cannot take account of other people's. White people create the dominant image of the world and don't quite see that they thus construct the world in their own image. White people set standards of humanity by which they are bound to succeed and others bound to fail. End quote. When it comes to Shakespeare, then, this is what I, as a brown Chicano, see. He is rarely made in my image. In a recent interview I did with Farah Karim-Cooper for a Shakespeare's Globe podcast, she asked me the relatively innocuous question, how did I come to Shakespeare? I explained that my first real encounter with Shakespeare was acting in a high school production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. What that conversation allowed me to reflect upon was why? You see, already by that point in high school, I had developed a love of literature. I was devouring it, and so much of it was what was assigned, and so much of what was assigned was white. I had seen Dead Poets Society and drank the Kool-Aid. I wanted to be Leonard trying out for Puck. I got cast as Oberon instead. But what are you going to do? What struck me, though, was realizing now how much as a teenager I willingly sought to identify with all those privileged white kids in that movie with access to Shakespeare and blondes and tweed jackets. I was a young Chicano living in La Frontera, but the pressures of assimilation were very, very real. It is all we saw in popular culture, and that was no accident. And while I learned to memorize the words of Shakespeare, to embrace that strangeness for that production, I also kept my Spanish. I code-switched with friends. I spoke it confidently with my mom and crossed linguistic, cultural, geographic, temporal, and discursive borders again and again. Ansaldúa says that ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity, and recognizing this, she argues, should be a source of confidence for Chicanexes. I never really thought about it, but I did see in my access to English different opportunities. My language is white. My language is brown. My language gets lost in both worlds. You can see then why perhaps it is so difficult to find one's voice when these tensions within the borderlands possess you. Crossing into Shakespeare studies brought all these apprehensions, these borderlands to the fore, and I navigated that. But it was in coming to early modern critical race studies. It was in entering a vibrant, intellectually stimulating, and generous community that I found another language altogether, one that allowed me to locate my confidence and value in my voice, value in what I do, and value in what I could bring to Shakespeare, and not vice versa. I found my home. I give my flowers today to all who made that possible. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. So in the program, you have a different title. My apologies. What motion is it that inflames your thoughts and stirs your valors to such sudden arms? Neurological Imaging, Race, and Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine. Ankh Uja Seneb. It's a Kemetic greeting, meaning wish you long life, prosperity, and health. Today, I too wish to celebrate on this 50th anniversary of the Shakespeare Association, Kim Hall. She writes in Things of Darkness, the correct insistence on race as a construction seems at times to be used as a shield against talking about racism, which is no less gainfully real just because it is fiction. In the early morning hours on June 12, 1963, in Jackson, Mississippi, a gunman hid in the honeysuckle bushes near the driveway of Medgar Evers, the 37-year-old field secretary for Mississippi for the National Association of Colored People. As Mr. Evers crossed his driveway, the gunman aimed an Enfield rifle at this husband and father of 3 children and shot him in the back. Mr. Evers staggered and collapsed on the doorstep of his house. After taking the shot, the gunman immediately dropped the rifle as its recoil forcefully drove its scope into his eye. He fled, leaving the rifle. Evers' wife, Marlowe, opened the door to the image of her bloodied and fatally wounded husband. Years later, in June 1991, Marlowe Evers, on the eve of her husband's second autopsy, said, "This is a very personal thing. This case is very important to me and my family, and I hope it's important to the state of Mississippi." This second autopsy was required also because the report for the first autopsy, along with other evidence, was missing. 2 medical examiners in New York were drafted to complete the task. Before opening the casket, they allowed Medgar Evers' son to witness its opening. To their surprise, the body of the failed civil rights leader from Mississippi was preserved in such pristine condition that he looked very much like the son who stood beside them. After 2 all-white, all-male deadlock jury verdicts in 1964, the gunman, now defendant Byron de la Beckwith, was finally convicted of the 1963 assassination and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1994. The struggle to find evidence, or more specifically, the truth in autopsies, continue even more in this contemporary moment as we watch the battle for autopsies in the death of George Floyd. Instead of a missing autopsy, as in the case of Medgar Evers, here the doctors, Dr. Andrew Baker, and the Hennepin County medical examiner, and Dr. Alicia Wilson of the University of Michigan, and finally Dr. Michael Baden, who also autopsied Medgar Evers, battled for the cause of death in the case, witnessed on camera by the entire world. A bystander filmed Officer Derek Chauvin press his knee on the neck of George Floyd, who gasped for air and repeatedly groaned, "Please, I can't breathe." One report suggests heart failure. The other reports asphyxiation from sustained neck pressure. The divergent reports seem to convolute the truth. Eventually, the defendant, Derek Chauvin, was convicted by a jury verdict. Earlier definitions of autopsy describe the process as seeing with one's own eyes, personal observation, experience, and inspection. Later, this definition gravitated toward the medical field that involved the examination of organs to determine the cause of death, the nature and extent of disease, result of treatment, essentially a post-mortem examination. While the autopsy serves as the post-mortem in the post-mortem space, what methods serve patients or people generally much earlier? In other fields, we might describe an autopsy as a critical examination or dissection of a subject or work. Today, it is an examination that I seek to apply to Marlowe's Tamburlaine. To assess the violence of racial trauma, this paper explores how Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine serves as a case study to examine closely treatment innovations, including cognitive, behavioral, and genetic research. Part of this analysis deploys images from paintings to brain imaging, courtesy of the Human Connectome Project, which provides a compilation of neural data and interface to use this data. For instance, the assessment of Tamburlaine's behavior as violent or aggressive proposes a corresponding brain image to portray visual proof of his alleged neurological state. How might potential patterns identify behaviors, feelings, and thoughts, or more significantly, offer solutions for ethnic and racial disparities found in neurological diseases, their treatment, their diagnosis, and aftercare? To develop some answers, I investigate the roles of warriors and captives. Some of these warriors, such as Shakespeare's Aaron the Moor, migrate from one role to another. Other warriors, like Tamburlaine, force others from warrior to captive. Across my larger concerns, I also confront the role of memory amongst these warriors and evaluate how remembrance, forgetting, memorialization function in the trauma narrative. This work becomes important as I critique the history of racial trauma, moral injury, mortality, the hidden wounds of warriors, particularly captured warriors, their psychosis and degradation. Racial trauma, a persistent consequence of historical trauma, and its effects emerge as devastating across the African diaspora and other diasporas as well. In effect, the trauma inflicts real and perceived danger, threats, bystander harm, or events both shameful and humiliating to similar members of the global majority, which include circumstances sudden, uncontrollable, emotionally overwhelming. Racial trauma may present itself in response to racism, including but not limited to discrimination and microaggressions that evoke stress and trauma reactions, and may be recurring, systemic, and intergenerational. The effects of racial trauma may devastate one's well-being, physical health, psychological distress, psychosocial impact like self-image and self-hatred, and an erosion of familial and communal relationships. Some scholars, like Derek Bell, co-founder of critical race theory, along with Kimberly Crenshaw, suggest that there is a, quote, enduring legacy of racism, particularly in America. The phenomenology of racial trauma may differ from post-traumatic stress syndrome in the DSM-5, as may encompass a wider range of symptoms, such as paranoia, avoidance of dominant group members, somatic symptoms, and excessive worries about loved ones. I have a caveat that although I defined it as distinctive from PTSD, a lot of the research that needs to be done to make some of the connections that I'm proposing has yet to be performed. A lot of this work looks future, as I will talk about a little bit later, but I want you to keep in mind that I'm using research from PTSD because a lot of the connections and discussions and the research for racial trauma has yet to be written. And I'm hoping this will help us do this. Timur, or Tamburlaine, was born April 9, 1366 in Kesh, near the area we now call Uzbekistan. And he died in Farah, near what we call Kazakhstan, in February 1405. His biography reads in many complicated layers, for his life crossed many geographical and cultural boundaries. As a result, many claim Timur, Tamburlaine, or Tamburlaine possessively and sometimes singularly as their own. Yet even in fiction, we read the many languages, nations, and people his life abutted many times aggressively and violently. Admittedly, telling the story of Timur from one perspective will undoubtedly read as failing to serve properly one or more of these nations. If anything, I find this quality of Timur even more provocative. I recall Linda McJanet's 2016 article entitled Timur's Theatrical Journey, or When Did Tamburlaine Become Black? I contrast that because we go from Edward Allen as Tamburlaine to John Douglas Thompson as Tamburlaine in 2014. So at the very least, he becomes black in 2014. There are some figures historically that seem to belong to the world, rightfully, wrongfully, accurately, or inaccurately. This warrior, who began his life as a shepherd like his father, found a way to take his leadership and conquest from the tribal level to a global scale, and his life ended just before he had directed his sights on China. The violence represented in his travels, engagements, battles, wars, conquests, including the tale that Christopher Marlowe weaves into this two-part play, left me curious as to the impact such a life would have not only on Tamburlaine, but those characters that surround him on the stage. What impact might these experiences have on them in terms of trauma? A brain autopsy, or referred to as neuropathy autopsy, helps combine this literary examination with a clinical one. When thinking of the references to images in the narrative and the brain images that reveal trauma, are these images that help tell this narrative filled with violence, suffering, and death across the many nations represented in this two-part play? Today, I ask, is there a need to re-examine how we see Tamburlaine? View but his picture in this tragic glass, then applaud his fortune as you please. Book 1, prologue. As I view the picture of Tamburlaine, I'm compelled to consider Timur. What can the image of this historical figure bring to this narrative? In answering this question, I observe forensic facial reconstruction, the forensic facial reconstruction by Soviet archaeologist, anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov, who died in 1970, but in his lifetime reconstructed over 200 faces from skulls. Using paleontology and forensic science, he wrote that it was a way to gaze into the faces of those long dead. From this image, I attempt a resurrection, or rather an exhumation of the figure of Timur. Within Gerasimov's reconstruction, I examine the sculpture of Timur. Immediately, I'm drawn to the captivating image. We can see the very lines in his face, his strength, and dare I say, the power that I imagine his very presence and glance conveyed. The artist captures a bold relentlessness in this figure of Timur. Just as Gerasimov revisits the visions of Timur, it is to rediscover him through images, the aspect, the very picture of this man whom Christopher Marlowe brings to the stage, and what I hope will emerge as not only provocative but meaningful as we think about the neurological implications of trauma on figures across these dramas. As I attempt to merge art and science in this endeavor, I find myself seeking to create a picture of what might offer us as we consider neurology. The Human Connectome Project and many others like it, the brain, mapping the brain, asking questions, developing tests, and creating images that may not provide answers, diagnoses, definitive conclusions now, for the endeavor is aspirational, inspirational, hopeful, and forward-looking. For instance, neurologists know that trauma alters the brain. They definitely know that. But what does that mean? What are those specific implications? And how we treat trauma are still questions left unanswered, perhaps for decades. Even as Marlowe creates a snapshot of Tamburlaine across this drama, we are invited to examine this character. Like his prologue, I attempt simultaneously to look forward and backward. Marlowe's construction of Tamburlaine's story as a tragic glass reads differently when juxtaposing the voluminous biographies of Timur. Undeniably, multiple sources yield the storied tactics of Timur as a warrior. At the same time, we have his compassionate liberation of people who have been enslaved by conquered foes. In my ongoing attempt to unpack a picture of Tamburlaine, I constantly asked myself, how am I considering the story of Tamburlaine? Is this warrior a victim, a victimizer, or both? The science tells us that specific networks of the brain areas change after specific aspects of traumatic events, including combat-related trauma. Neuroimaging could explain specific trauma-related mechanisms. Setting aside these dichotomies, these binaries of victim, victimizer, essentially these distractions in his complicated life story, is it possible to locate his trauma? Where might I locate these moments? Are there visual proofs or even verbal ones? How might we find tools to create an assessment of Tamburlaine or any other character in this drama? Let us take, for instance, the place where Marlowe conspicuously offers us visual proof found much later in Book 2. I submit that we don't witness much of the earlier trauma of Tamburlaine or Timur's experiences. We do, however, witness the constant battles, the aggression, the enactment of violence to take strongholds, acquire land, and yes, a wife. What do we derive from this picture of What do we derive from this picture of Xenocrate as a path toward an analysis of neurological fallout of trauma? Is this scene about her and her life as they give homage to her, or is it about Tamburlaine? Is this really about a general commentary on grief? We have this 1597 portrait of Xenocrate from the play. Strikingly, we never find out exactly what condition fells her. The physician merely says, "My lord, your majesty shall soon perceive, and if she pass the fit, worst is past." What is this fit? As I study neurology, it could mean many things. J.S. Cunningham, in the edition of Tamburlaine, uses the Oxford English Dictionary and provides the definition, severe period of illness or crisis. In the case of ongoing trauma, as in domestic abuse cases, doctors disagree on how to treat such patients. However, they do have one consensus, and that is the need for the patient to have a, quote, safe and stable environment. For those of you who are familiar with the story of Tamburlaine, that doesn't really describe Xenocrate's environment. Is Xenocrate an abused partner, a witness suffering bystander phenomenon, or a warrior in her own right? In the following, Tamburlaine describes the audience as an image of Xenocrate. Describes the audience, for the audience, an image of Xenocrate. He says, And here the picture of Zenocrate to show her beauty, which the world admired, sweet picture of divine Zenocrate, that hanging there will draw the gods from heaven and cause the stars fixed in the southern arc, whose lovely faces never any viewed that have not paused the center's latitude, as pilgrims travel to our hemisphere only to gaze upon Zenocrate. Here we have an articulated picture of Zenocrate. We are asked to memorialize her, to mourn her. The picture that we have of her, daughter of the Sultan of Egypt, wife of Tamburlaine, the warrior, emerges as remarkably benign, with the exception of her feud with Zabina, the empress of the Turks and wife to Jabez. We have several images of the bondage, the journey of bondage in the play from Bajazeth and his wife. So as we think about this particular moment, Marlowe does not tell us what inspires this aggression and this treatment of this couple. However, a Greek scholar from the 14th century arose, Demetrius Chalcondylas, this incident arose out of a provocation by Bajazeth, whose comments about Zenocrate were not well received by Tamburlaine or Zenocrate. In our final picture, or image for examination, I will move to Caliphas, the son of Tamburlaine and Zenocrate, who meets a fateful end not long after the death of his mother. The references that Tamburlaine chooses to communicate his disdain for his son are caustic and conspicuous, and perhaps foretells the end of Caliphas. Image of sloth and picture of a slave, the obloquy and scorn of my renown, how many my heart thus fired with mine eyes, wounded with shame, killed with discontent, shroud any thought may hold my striving hands, from martial justice on thy wretched soul. That's Book 2, Act 4, Scene 1, line 91. Tamburlaine discussion of Caliphas yields a stark contrast to how he spoke of his treasured Zenocrate and honoring her memory. Tamburlaine is inflicted with shame by the behavior of the wretched son, Caliphas. For Tamburlaine, he must exact justice upon his son who taints a warring legacy. Not unlike the contrasting personalities of a father and son in this play, the pictures of the brain when one emotes love as opposed to the pain conveyed with neurological responses. So here we have in this study of emotion theory, this center at the top, the figure at the top is what it looks like, the red large areas of what pain looks like. Love is in the bottom figure. And so we have this kind of contrasting effect of what these emotions look like, which may account for some of the contrast between Caliphas and his father. And at this juncture, I am compelled to ask if Caliphas must die because his father's fear that weakness he perceives in his son may be imputed to him. Does this perceived weakness become a way to embolden his enemies to exploit for their own purposes? Is it that Tamburlaine is running away from his image of slave, and that is why Caliphas has to die? While Tamburlaine claims that the behavior of Caliphas wounds him with shame, perhaps it is not shame, but an unshakable fear. Has his display of aggression really emerged as a mask of his own crippling fear that Caliphas deigned to claim, articulate, and exhibit authentically? In this subplot, is Caliphas really the one with fearlessness, as his brothers warn him against displaying his penchant for peace, his disdain for violence, and his disinterest in the art of war? exeunt bearing out the body. In 1968, scientists utilized X-ray imaging to examine the cranium of King Tutankhamun from his tomb. Even earlier, in 1925, Carter and Derry examined King Tut's via X-ray. Unfortunately, trauma-inflicted autopsy resulted in 2 pieces of his skull being dislodged. In this autopsy, Tutankhamun's body was dismembered. In 2014, a virtual autopsy was performed with CT scans, genetic analysis, and over 2,000 digital scans without sacrificing the body. While we cannot overlook the violence committed upon the interred remains of this ruler, these radiographs were eventually able to dispel the theory that King Tut's death was by homicide. Although we cannot dismiss the insights that come from pathology, it is my hope that we will utilize neuroimaging so perhaps one day we can diagnose, treat, and perhaps prevent trauma during the lifetime of the patient instead of after that life has expired. Anja Seneb, wish you all long life, prosperity, and health. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you all hear? I'll be speaking from here just because my glasses, it's easier for me to read here than from there, so forgive me. Right? This is just a function of... Can you hear me now? Is that okay? Okay, great. And I'll project as well as I go along. Thank you. I'm grateful that we get to celebrate the 50th anniversary of this organization and thank all that includes our graduate students whose work sustains a vibrant present and directs us towards shared transformative futures. On such an occasion, perhaps no more text might better serve our conversation than that most canonical play written by that most canonical of authors. Hazlitt's declaration, "It is we who are Hamlet," has been repeated in multiple forms across the centuries by various scholars. Elsewhere, I have questioned this fidelity to Hamlet, to contrast our critical receptivity to Othello, and to probe what I understand to be Shakespeare's test of our racial literacy. Today, I wish to return to this matter of the traditional scholarly identification with Hamlet to ask directly what might be the unexamined implications of this long-standing attachment. Immediately upon hearing from Rosencrantz that he, along with Guildenstern, passed the players who were making their way toward the castle, Hamlet immediately begins to rehearse some of the character types he might expect to find in their repertory: the adventurous knight, the lover, the humorous man, the clown, the lady. Though Hamlet's recitation might appear curious, it reveals a consciousness on Shakespeare's part in attending to the character types that the theater fostered, and one that his own play was to interrogate for its profound cultural effects. Inquiring after the identity of the players, who are reportedly coming specifically to offer Hamlet their service, the theater aficionado prince is informed by Rosencrantz, quote, "even those you were wont to take such delight in, the tragedians of the city." Hamlet welcomes them collectively as good friends, and the first player especially as my old friend, who has grown a beard since their last encounter. Having patronized their entertainments on multiple previous occasions, Hamlet is intimately acquainted with the troupe, the actors, their likely roles, and importantly, their standard play offerings, including the company's little-known Pyrrhus extract that he had heard recited. But the play itself was never acted, or if it was, not above once, since it failed to garner popular success, though lauded by the intelligentsia. It is precisely a speech from this little-known play that Hamlet eagerly requests for an impromptu performance. Eager to reconnect with the players, Hamlet cannot wait for the formal performance and asks for an immediate display of their acting craft. Come, give us a taste of your quality. Come, a passionate speech. He suggests a speech that he had heard one of the players deliver once before. 'Twas Aeneas' tale of Dido, and thereabout of it, especially when he speaks of Priam's slaughter, the lines of which Hamlet begins to recite himself. The rugged Pyrrhus, he whose sable arms, black as his purpose, did the knight resemble when he lay couched in the ominous horse, hath now this dread and black complexion smeared with heraldry more dismal. The history of critical commentary and what has been traditionally referred to as the player's speech ranges from indifference to doubt concerning its artistic relevance. Editorial glosses capitulate to the objectively neutral zone of heraldry, and Margrethe de Grazia concludes that, quote, in recognition of Pyrrhus's cold-blooded savagery, he achieves a coat of arms intended as the insignia of chivalry, end quote. But why overlook or deny the seemingly obvious? That Pyrrhus, as conceived by Shakespeare, is black, articulated in multiple linguistic codes. Hamlet's choice of theatrical speech focuses on Pyrrhus, the ferocious killing machine of classical literature, whose deadly excesses are central to his story. Also named Neoptolemus by ancient writers, Pyrrhus, meaning fiery or red-haired, is bent on a bloody rampage to avenge the death of his father Achilles at the hands of the Trojans. Exiting the baleful wooden horse, he lays such waste to the entire city that he's covered with thick clots of blood that make him appear monstrously oversized with coagulate gore as he moves through the burning streets searching for Priam. The relevance of Hamlet's choice of subject, a son avenging his father's murder, is immediately clear for the audience who knows of the ghost's call for revenge. Through his insistence on not only citing, but also reciting and enacting this legendary moment in literary historiography, Hamlet imagines himself as Pyrrhus, abandoning delay in toppling Claudius in this Virgilian fantasy of gore. Importantly, the descriptions of Pyrrhus from Homer, Virgil, Euripides through to Marlowe are consistent regarding this ultimate warrior. There is no mention of his blackness, whereas in Shakespeare's account, Pyrrhus is a black, grotesquely bloody avenger who far surpasses in brutality any ruthless black man early modern audiences had seen. Classical writers, in fact, emphasized both the physical appearance and the fierce Greeks' fair good looks. In Andromache, for example, Euripides tells the story of Neoptolemus' ambush and murder at the shrine of Delphi, during which his, quote, whole fair form was rent with terrible wounds, end quote. Even in death, right, in his Neoptolemus' death, writers highlight his fair beauty, his white appearance that stands in sharp distinction to Hamlet's somatically black avenger, and the lethargic prince seeks to appropriate for himself. Much of the play's criticism has either avoided discussing this Black Pyrrhus passage altogether, or ignored Shakespeare's vivid details, thereby producing a whitewashed or race-neutral analysis. Even among those who discuss the Pyrrhus figure, the result is the same, as if a racial blind spot had effected textual erasure. Hamlet the play is self-consciously meta-theatrical, as we all know, with its multiple verbal references to show, act, play, as Maynard Mack pointed out in the 1950s. Well over half a century later, Lyle Asher maintains that the several instances of the word stage constitute the most in any individual Shakespeare play, making Hamlet, quote, among other things, a play about playing, a show of shows, end quote. As a connoisseur of plays, playwriting, playing, and playgoers, Hamlet is deeply aware of theater's purpose, conventions, and contemporary debates. In his conversation with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Hamlet is intrigued by the news of the late innovation in the city, the growing popularity of the boy actors pitted against adult companies for market share of the audience that has apparently precipitated the arrival of the traveling company of players. The significance of Hamlet's early recitation of familiar theatrical types becomes clear with his evocation of Black Pyrrhus, for such a figure belongs to a new and popular theatrical type, the violent or murderous black man. When the Negro Muley Hamlet of George Peele's The Battle of Alcazar stepped onto the stage in 1589, audiences in the mimetic theater had their first real taste of the racialized, threatening black man. Quote, black in his look and bloody in his deeds, and in his shirt stained with a cloud of gore, presents himself with naked sword in hand. The combination, black in his look and bloody in his deeds, established a racial paradigm that would have an enduring stage legacy. That is, the seamless integration of the literal and connotative meaning of a black man's skin and the evil that colors him within. Such a black man is produced within the discourse of criminality. Shortly after Alcazar's debut, Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus gave audiences a spectacular and deadly concoction of devilish ingenuity in Aaron the Moor, to be followed by Lust Dominion, 1599, that perpetuates the legacy of the ruthless black killer in Eleazar the Moor. Among the pioneering early modern race scholars, Edward Jones, Elliot Tocsin, Anthony Gerard Bartholomew, and Jack D'Amico have documented the black drama and the negative stage representations of Africans and Moors in the period. But placing Hamlet within this theatrical history opens dramatically new critical vistas for the play. The dramatic narrative of Black Pyrrhus is Hamlet's choice. But importantly, this speech that he has memorized already belonged in the traveling player's repertory. The violent or murderous black man is not Hamlet's invention, as has been established in the dramatic literature dating 11 years back to George Peele. Shakespeare, in making it clear that this figure already exists in the itinerant player's catalog, helps us understand something about the cultural history of the theater and the growing popularity of this black man type. This figure is interesting because it had not previously existed in the English theater, I would argue, or had the dramatic ubiquity like the adventurous knight or the lover in the preceding centuries. Hamlet helps us understand, however, that it is now a recurring figure and sign of early modernity, one that is poised to extend beyond the narrative limits of character type to pose serious and culturally demanding questions about personal and national identity mediated through blackness, criminality, and race. Hamlet's investment in Black Pyrrhus is also overdetermined by the project of revenge itself, that requires the avenger to become like the original perpetrator. Revenge tragedy, writes Ronald Brood, is usually understood to center around a figure who conceives himself to have been seriously wronged and who, overcoming obstacles both within and outside himself, contrives eventually to exact retribution, becoming in the process as depraved as those by whom he has been wronged. To compound matters, the play's motivating fratricide is executed by the ostensibly white Claudius, whom the punning prince calls a Moor, a fluid early modern term for African and black person, here instantly identified with acts of betrayal, violence, bloodlust, and murder. While many modern editions erase the racial content of Hamlet's language by using the lowercase Moor or ignore the matter altogether, in the textual commentary, both the second quarter and first folio offer assistance in capitalizing Moor. Having insisted not only on Claudius's criminality, but also specifically on the connection of racial blackness to violence, Hamlet has implicated himself fully, if rather uneasily, in a disturbing and damaging ideation of the Moor. For Hamlet, the revenge genre's principle of resemblance has special meaning, as it points to the racial identification with which the avenging prince grapples. Such a recognition must now become an unavoidable priority among scholars. Shakespeare encourages us to revisit the revenge genre's trademark mix of incandescent, hate-filled anger and excessive bloody acts of vengeance in the expansive context of the emerging drama of the period that gives us the violent black man. While blackness impinges on Hamlet's identity, given the structural inevitability of the revenger's behavioral and moral destiny, his open hostility to Claudius, grounded in the deeply racial constructs of the period, suggests that Hamlet's career will be fraught with racial attraction and repulsion, the push and pull of doubt, ambiguity, and delay. Committed as he is to this program of blackness, Hamlet requests the murder of Gonzago, intending to provoke Claudius's guilty conscience. To sustain the consistency of this program, the murderer Lucianus will also be black, yet another among the racial blind spots of the play's scholarship. Hamlet's query about the traveling player's readiness to perform the murder of Gonzago includes an economy of equipment and properties comparable to the reduced repertory of London traveling companies. Given the company's business and artistic infrastructure, its in-house playwrights, as well as individually purchased plays, actors in specialist, tragic, comedic, or female roles, costumes and properties reused from one production to another, some overlap among groups of plays is likely to pertain. Rosalind Knudsen argues similarly that, quote, theater historians are looking within and across lines of company ownership and giving new attention to repertory items that share such issues as politics, international trade and exploration, social governance, gender and sexuality, labor, religion, science, and/or domestic relations. For Hamlet, the local expert looking within the traveling company's repertory, the overlapping issue is blackness and race. He is that early modern theater historian who perceives significant racial content within and across the Black Pyrrhus play and the murder of Gonzago. Discussion of a black repertoire requires the material means of theatrical personation. In Arthur Kinney's historical reconstruction of traveling theater companies, players carried, quote, costumes, properties, and play scripts covering perhaps 25 miles a day. But performing blackness also required transporting specialized properties and cosmetics for disguising white skin. Immediately before Lucianus arrives on stage, Hamlet addresses him from the sidelines, urging the actor in language that constitutes a critical piece of racial evidence that has gone largely undiscussed. Quote, begin, murderer, pox, leave thy damnable faces and begin. Robert Lublin argues that stagecraft is often implied in the language that serves as a performance blueprint for Hamlet. Quote, apparel, cosmetics, color, and accoutrement appear in the dialogue and stage directions of virtually every scene in Shakespeare's longest play. These references are more than literary allusions. They are also markers that hint at the way Shakespeare's original production was staged, seen, and understood in the early modern English theater. End quote. It is noteworthy, therefore, that modern editors, including Edwards, Hibbard, Miola, have avoided glossing the statement, begin, murderer, pox, leave thy damnable faces and begin, thereby eliding or ignoring its racially performative import. Hamlet is a notoriously fastidious stage manager, offering sharp directives to the players about actually comportment, diction, and gestural style. So Hamlet's charge to the actor playing Lucianus to cease making, quote, damnable faces, that is, to stop rehearsing the exaggerated stock-in-trade stage looks, is of a piece with his mandates on acting decorum. Shakespeare's use of the racially resonant damnable faces makes it clear that the actor's rehearsed facial set pieces belong to the specific category of the overwrought facial contortions of the stage Moor that relies on the widespread assumptions of devils as proto-racial Moors. The phrase damnable faces thus denotes the exaggerated expressions of the white actor that would be magnified through the application of face blackening agents. The first and probably most intuitively recognizable prosthetic effect of racialization in the early modern theater is the direct application of substances to the skin. Thus, the use of charcoal or soot is conveyed in Aaron's well-known description as a coal-black Moor. Even more pertinent here, however, is the denigration of Eleazar in Decker's Lust Dominion as, quote, having damnation died upon his flesh. The metaperformative language, damnation died upon his flesh, echoes substantively Lucianus's damnable faces. And awareness of this performative tradition allows modern students of the play to recognize that Lucianus, like his compeer Pyrrhus, is black. Thus, Hamlet completes his project of racial improvisation that maintains his corporeal integrity as white, while enabling him to fantasize about black criminality as a murderous disposition he will put on to enact extrajudicial justice in a bloody family and national drama. Who then wants to be like Hamlet? From our historical perspective, Hamlet does, in fact, rival the late Innovation, reportedly causing a stir in the city theaters. But the real disturbance for the modern Shakespeare industry that has forged an identification with Hamlet is its complicity in constructing the damaging, racist, and fatal myth of the violent or murderous black man of early and subsequently late modernity. Such a type lends itself all too readily to the dictum, to plunder a people of everything, you must plunder their humanity first. To be clear, white Enlightenment violence has often been bracketed through strategies of forgetting and displacement that in turn construct persons of African descent as dangerous and therefore deserving of suitable punishment and corporal containment. According to this egregious logic of projection, if the black person is a priori a threat, preemptive erasure is a morbid justification for the health of civil society. Hence, the criminalization of blackness in the post-slavery era and the record of brutality and murder of black persons have a prehistory that is exemplified in Hamlet's circulation of the violent black person type. If I'm right in my assessment of the racial stakes in Hamlet, then, as inheritors of the play's canonical legacy, we are morally bound to reflect deeply on the racial blind spots in our scholarship, to affirm instead an anti-racist practice of the present and future. Thank you.
We have time for questions, so I ask that if you have questions, if you could form a socially distanced queue behind the microphone, that would be great. So any questions? Just say a huge thank you to those amazing, extraordinary papers. What a panel. Don't be shy. Anyone? There you go. Erica Lynn.
Thank you for these amazing papers. I'm interested in bringing them into dialogue with each other, and I'm thinking specifically about the way that the issues that Ian raises with regard to Hamlet's anxiety and desire to, and I'm talking about the character's desire to both play the revenger, but then the fear of racial contamination, how that intersects with Lisa's paper with regard to the imprint of trauma on the face and also on the brain. And I'm thinking about this specifically in relation to acting practice and the fact that the actor's face is precisely that which both does and does not signify at the same time. And so the body of the actor is like the body that Ruben brings up in talking about the inevitable brown skin that is always visible. But at the same time, in order to play more than one character, unless you only ever play one character, your face does not signify. And so I'm interested in the way these panel papers bring together both the fixity and unfixity of race at the same time. And if there's a way that you could elaborate on that interrelationship and how you see it working out in each of your three subjects, I would be grateful. So thank you.
Well, certainly what I was, there's an obvious connection between what Lisa is doing and what I was doing. The whole idea of violence and brutality and how that gets perpetuated and circulated and becomes so much a part of what I've called modernity, right? So there is that. What happens in Hamlet, I believe, is he not only plays with the idea of blackness in a particularly troubling way, but he does so as something that he can use. And that's what's so troubling for me. It's how one can use blackness and then set it aside when it no longer is of value to you. And so what Hamlet is doing, both with regard to himself and to Claudius, it's not that there's a sort of racial transformation, that they become black men. What is truly troubling is that there's a creation of the idea of what black men must be like, and how the idea of black men is inevitably linked to certain ideas of violence and danger, etc. That is the truly troubling part. So it's not so much that so yes, he fears, as you said, that contamination. But the troubling part is the legacy of how we create those ideas. And so what Ruben expressed in his paper and Farah talked about earlier in her address today as well, was the idea that in a way, as people of color, we're all sort of born into a world in which we're encouraged to be epistemologically white, at least, right? And to want and to have that desire for whiteness. And there becomes a sort of unlearning period for most of us, if not all of us, that we have to then go through. So we too have been asked to think of our own bodies not as a real thing, although we experience that as a very real thing, but to think of the ideas about our body. And we have to unlearn that every day for a very long time, if not all of our lives.
Well, first of all, I want to applaud Erica for her acrobatics and trying to get this together and articulate it so brilliantly. What comes to mind for me in terms of your question is what I've worked on in the past with my student presentations on it in El Paso, Texas, and the way they navigate on their own, never having spoken about any of this to my students, I don't typically, address these issues necessarily straightforwardly, right? But I do ask them to think about their positionalities, but always those markers, right, of skin and the way that they cast themselves in particular roles when I have them do adaptations of Shakespeare, right, based on that skin color. It was, and it has been, I think, very, very evident to me, what I spoke about earlier is the way that those who had a different command of the English language versus those who did not would then try to identify themselves in this way. And it is always a matter, I think, of approximating whiteness. I wrote about it in an article, a production by Catherine Gillen's students at Texas A&M San Antonio, and their, really brilliant use of the Merchant of Venice to explore these particular issues of linguistic identity. And I was struck particularly, right, by the way that they think about the shared language, how the Antonio and the Shylock character very much were similar, in terms of skin color, right, and presenting themselves. But always it seemed to be always it seems to be presented as those who are approximating whiteness gain something, right? And so the deficit is in place with those who are not wanting to attempt that. And her students were able to show the Shylock character, who was not trying to attempt that, as the most confidence of characters at all, possible, right? And this to me seems striking in terms of thinking of negotiating that and trying to get students to flip the script in the way of not a binary, right, but really to take stock and feel comfortable in their skin, as it were, right, owning that, bringing that to the table, and not trying to fall into these neat categories that it presents to them. And so it's, for me, disheartening that I'm finding that only in student productions, right, that this doesn't work its way up in the field, and that is something that I little by little, I'm seeing more of it and really finding that energizing. When it's, I think, full-fledged, it will be an interesting dynamic.
I, of course, enjoy both of my colleagues' papers, and I like Erica's question in a sense that this through line in this idea of the fixed and unfixed throughout each of our papers. There's this discussion of criminality, memory, and forgetting that is very much where my paper sits that Ian responds to, and this idea of forgetting one's ancestry, the anxiety associated with the border, and the anxiety that one must deal with in an unarticulated way that actually heightens racial trauma in a way that we are just learning how to articulate. I am seriously concerned with this through line because though this model, this aspect, this way of moving in the world has been always thus under colonialism, it is something that we are just scratching the surface in terms of the academy, in terms of research, in terms of how we move socially. And so I think if we're going to be frank, if we're going to teach our students truth, if we're going to change the kind of propaganda and the kind of decentering of the global majority in a way that erases other cultures, I think we have to do our own kind of work if we're actually expecting students to grow and understand and go out into the world and become that inspirational, that aspirational change makers that we want them to be. And so I think first we have to be very honest with ourselves so that we can actually be honest in our research and writing.
I'm not quite so bold as Erica to try to interlace all the papers. I'm joining Professor Smith in being really troubled now at Hamlet. I tried writing on race in Hamlet, and I didn't think I could get anywhere beyond what people like Patricia Parker and David Sterling Brown have done. And so you're inspiring me to try maybe to go a little further, and I wonder if what you find troubling about the handling of race in these characters that you've aligned, the way that Hamlet treats them, Lucianus, Pyrrhus, Claudius, if what's troubling there is Hamlet the character, and might we be able to displace some of what's troubling about the handling of race onto the character Hamlet, who is the one who's treating each of these figures in the way that you've outlined? Might that make Shakespeare, the author, less troubling insofar as maybe he's inviting us, the audience, to critique Hamlet, who's the troubling one behind that? Is that possible? Is that clear enough as a question?
Oh, yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes, yes,
I'm
thank
sorry
you.
if it was...
No, that's fine, thank you. Yes, I'm hoping that, to address the very first part of your query, that in trying to return to a play like this, that it will make us pause and go back and rethink and pay closer attention to the ways in which that this play, I think this play is a major race play. I think that before he wrote Othello, Hamlet is a race character that Shakespeare is struggling to articulate something through and about before he gets to Othello, and I truly believe that's so. I'm not saying that to be, to make some kind of sensation. I really think that is actually what's going on. If you, as I said, locate the play within the history of the other drama that treats emerging black characters in the period, once we just adjust the frame, then to me it becomes very clear that that's what he's doing. And if that becomes clear, then yes, I think that we can begin to do a host of other works. Your questions about where to place or displace the blame. I think I know what you're getting at. I would say this. I'm not one who goes around saying that Shakespeare is X or Y, right? Because what do I know about Shakespeare? But what is so interesting is that the play raises these questions for us. And the play makes us think. The words make us think, and I see Brandy standing beside you. Not that I know what she's going to ask, but but as I was giving my paper, I was thinking about, because Brandy works in editorial material, and I've heard myself talk about editors. I'm thinking, and if we can just pay attention to the language, I think we learn a lot. Somebody said to me once, "Oh, Ian, you're a close reader," and I thought, is that what I am? But maybe that is what I am. I'm not sure if that helps. Yeah.
My question's for Ian, but surprised it's not about editing. My question's actually about, do you think that Hamlet puts on the mantle of blackness sooner?
Yes.
When he talks about, it's not my inky cloak, mother, and I think you've just radically changed how I look at this play. I'm the first person to admit I hate Hamlet. I'm not interested in it. The differences between the first quarto and the second quarto and the folio, I'm just those are arguments for people that just aren't me. And darn it, Ian, you've made this play something that's alive again for me, so I want to thank you. But also I do wonder, does he become black through grief? And is that something that happens during the course of the play?
From the very opening scene, at some point in Act 1, Scene 5, really, he says, "Oh, my prophetic soul," when the ghost says, "Here's what happened." So if we take that seriously, it means that he had long suspected something has gone wrong, right? Whether it's, Gertrude doing weird stuff, or certainly it's about, Claudius having done the deed of killing the father. So when Hamlet first appears, one of the first things he says when more than king, less than kind, there's stuff there too, but we don't have enough time to go into that. But the other thing, just after that, the uncle says to him, these clouds hang upon you. He says, "I'm too much in the sun." Now, it's S-U-N. And very often, critics, editors, whatever, say, "Oh, there's a pun on S-U-N to S-O-N," which is fine, and that's great. But really, we forget something very simple, that if you approach this from a sort of, just doing the homework that allows us to think about racial matters. That's all it is. I'm not asking everybody to become a critical race scholar. Just do the normal homework we would all do, right? We know there's a story about how black people came into the world in Ovid, that text that all of these people were using. And the story is simply this. Phaeton is the son of the sun god Phoebus. And he goes to his mother and he says, who's my real father? And so on and so on. Eventually, he goes to Phoebus and he says, I heard you're my father. And he says, oh, sure, you can have one wish. Oh, I can? I want to ride the sun chariot across the sky. And oh, no, you can't do that because you can't manage it. And of course, what happens? The boy goes in the chariot, it comes too close to the earth, and it singes the people below. And the text says, essentially, and thus were black people born. Too much in this, and hence the word Ethiopia means those people of a sunburned face. So when Hamlet says, I'm too much in the sun, is it a stretch from the beginning that he's thinking? That is the narrative behind that line about being racially black and I'm too much in the sun. In other words, Hamlet from the very beginning, when he says to us, oh, my prophetic soul, he already is in, as you said, vengeance mode or revenge mode, but he doesn't know it for sure yet. And when the ghost tells him, he has a little bit more proof, of course, but he's concerned. Can I really trust them? So the entire play is about this man trying to manage this idea of blackness and revenge, but then blackness as a kind of sort of racial quality that one aligns with bloody acts and violence and criminality as well. So it's there from the very beginning. Of course, right after that, the mother says, why are you dressed the way you are? And he says, it's a black clothing thing. Everybody should know at this point in time, and if you don't, self-promotion, read an essay by me somewhere. Black clothing is the way. Actors dressed up as black characters on the stage by putting black cloth over their skins. So it's not a surprise that Hamlet turns up in inky black clothing on the stage. It's all there. So let's just rethink this play as a major play about race in Shakespeare's canon. It really is. Please, yeah.
Hi, thank you for this great panel. So in your discussion, Ian, of the attribution of criminality, this sort of paradigm, right, of blackness as something that requires preemptive punishment. Yeah. And then in Lisa's really compelling reading of trauma, like whose trauma counts, feels very much like, again, part of like preemptively, what do we assume as valuable within the Commonwealth, and the discussion of borders, and both physical and metaphorical, feel all of them in some way, I feel, think about the racial paradigm of citizenship in terms of whiteness and in terms of belonging. And I wonder if you can all speak a little bit about citizenship and race, and not in terms of obviously like the documents of it, but the way citizenship is a kind of counting, right? A kind of being counted and participating, and in fact, a very Renaissance concept of sovereignty, right, is sort of tied to that. So I just wonder if some of these conversations, especially in the place that we are now, the moment that we exist in, where our participation as citizens seems to be that much more important as an awareness of how that is a racial paradigm. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Everybody.
Yeah, I'll speak to it. Just as Ian was talking about Hamlet, and I agree with Brandy. I mean, it makes me see it in a wonderfully rich way, especially as I've been trying to think about it. So in terms of citizenship, this is a play I often teach through the issue of hospitality at the onset, when Hamlet says then to Horatio, then as a stranger, give it welcome, right? And it puts the impetus and the emphasis on the idea that we should welcome the stranger, right? Later in the play, obviously you have the players coming in and there's, hospitality involved there. And then Ophelia's, the owl was a baker's daughter is a story about hospitality and generosity. And so, to think about that play and to think about the alienation that Hamlet feels, I think is critical to thinking about his place. And if we are then, introducing the equation of blackness in that dynamic, I'd like to put things into conversation with contemporary products, right? And I'm just thinking of the To Be Black, hashtag To Be Black film that the public put out shortly after the murder of George Floyd. And in it, 30 black actors recite the to be or not to be speech. And it's I think, brilliantly made. It shows footage from the civil rights era, and then it shows a protest from that summer, and then you come into the 30 black actors reciting that speech, and it is incredibly moving to feel the kind of exhaustion of existence, right, with these recursive acts of violence again and again. And so, in this regard, I think thinking about citizenship, thinking about unbelonging, right, there are ways to navigate the plays to think about that, and I feel that that's critical, especially in the aftermath of those events in that summer. I admit it. I felt hopeful after that summer. I felt like people were finally paying attention. I don't again, and that's hard. I mean, that feels hard to again and again come to this point where it feels like there's a recognition and then there's not. There's a recognition and then there's not.
It has me also thinking about Oric, and I am thinking of my discussion of neurology and the skull and the handling of the skull and the examining of the visage, and Gerasimov's great project of reconstructing faces in order to see the dead living. And so it's making me make connections not just with race but also with trauma and how we are handling mental health, how we're handling neurological issues, how we're treating that, because for me, I see this as kind of springboarding out and thinking about the neurological issues that each of the characters in Hamlet have, and trying to connect that to this conversation that I'm trying to have about this theory of racial trauma and how it manifests across several plays. Thank you.
Oh, I love that. Because there's so much to do with the gravedigger scene. But that's great. I love that. So I'm not going to do the Hamlet response. I'm just going to say 1719, the U.S. Congress defined citizenship as being white and being free. That's it. So our own Congress told us how we are to understand citizenship, and it's completely racialized. Leap forward to 1865, right afterwards, what happens? They introduce criminality as a way of ensuring that people re-enter into slavery, right? That's the history, right? So, again, this play opens up those kinds of questions for us about precisely those issues that are so instrumental and profoundly tied to this country, the United States, our history of citizenship, and our history of those who count as non-citizens, right? Race, criminality. These are the stories that matter. These are the myths that we tell ourselves and how we define ourselves. A play like Hamlet, which is so, as I said, canonical, we have to go back and revisit this, because as Brandy says, when I was taught Hamlet, it's this little guy running around the place, sad, and delayed for 4 hours. I mean, is that it? Right, Brandy? That's what it felt like. And so, I just couldn't understand what all the fuss was about. And so it took me a long time. It's about the unlearning. I had to sort of unlearn a lot to hopefully try to learn. And, I can't claim that I've learned it all, obviously not. But I think I have found a way in that makes the play so much more interesting as a way of thinking about, well, why that play and why then? Why in those 11 years, since 1589, a play like that appears? That inserts that kind of information there. And then why 4 years later a play like Othello appears as well, right? So,
yeah. If I can add one more thing, just because it allows me to say gay. But it's thinking about citizenship and specifically the Chicanx experience, which I didn't speak to. Arturo Islas' book, La Mali and the King of Tears, you have a gay Chicano writer who was a professor of English, the first professor to earn tenure Chicano professor to earn tenure at Stanford University. And he had written quite a few books at this time, and one of his biographers speaks about the fact that whenever he would send in his manuscripts, that they would often come with the responses from New York editors saying, there's not enough barrio life, there needs to be more struggle, and this is not what he was writing. But in this final book, before he died prematurely of AIDS, he creates a story and that allows for him to explore his position, I think his own position as a Chicano within the academy, as a writer, and it really is this kind of voyage in and out of Shakespeare. And I do think he's using it in many plays, including Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet. The title of the novel is from King Lear. He calls King Lear the King of Tears, and just weaving it throughout as a way to almost show his audience, I have a command, I have an understanding, I'm a smart man. Like I can allude to Shakespeare, I think, brilliantly, right? And in this move to, I think, recognize some sort of acceptance, for me, it's telling that this book is understudied, undertaught, right, and really not something that is visible. And so that, I think, speaks to some of those issues of the citizenship, not in the broader sense, but also within the academy.
Just quickly, it's so lovely to be here and just nerd out with you lot about Shakespeare. The only time I've ever had to understudy in my life, I had to understudy Xenocraty in the RSC's 1989-90 production of Tamburlaine, with Tony Sher playing Tamburlaine and a very blonde Bajazeth. It's lovely, all this stuff coming together. There's a wonderful novel called The Unbelonging by a black British writer called Joan Riley. I read it in the early 80s. It broke my heart, that sense of being but not being, being the American or being the British but not. Aaron the Moor, I want to crawl on the floor whenever Aaron the Moor is. So I'm just thinking about that trajectory from Aaron the Moor through to Othello, and what happens to and now beautiful, the Hamlet stuff, beautiful, and where that comes in that continuum, and what is going on in Shakespeare's evolution as a person who sees other people. Is an evolution happening? That's a whole fantastic conversation to think about. So the sense of the body, even at primary school, in the school play in my tiny white village in the middle of the Cotswolds in England, where I can still milk cows by hand if called upon, always having to play the wicked queen. Or any number of baddies, because, even at that high, that sense of reflecting evil doing in the little brown girl face was, what I was there for. I'll talk about this later with Farah, but when Richard II, I did it during Brexit with a big old flag of St. George, which is generally the white symbol of you can go back where you came from, with my big ass brown face right in the front, to just go, there is no Great Britain without the black body, without the brown body, without the colonized body, without the plunder that came from, that caused the flourishing. So this has just been a beautiful, I'm so thrilled to be here and to have heard all your brilliance and the brilliant questions, and thank you, nerds, for having me.
I don't think there's a better way to close this session. I'm going to ask you to join us at the Scholars of Color Social. It's on the lower river deck, I think. Anyway, you'll find it. There's signage. Thank you again for all of those fantastic papers, and thank you for coming.